Now this is the first diagram, and it shows roughly what has been happening in New Zealand over the last 30 years. How can A sell to dead B? This is a 30-year period, and we're dealing here with a population that grew slowly up to 4 million, which we have today in New Zealand, and we're likely in the future to grow to, say, 5. On current trends. But when I was a schoolboy in 1965, I could look forward to a period in which the population of New Zealand would have been 8 million, going on for 16 or 12 or something like that by the time of my death, say at 80. So by now we could have had 8 million people based on the birth rates of 1965. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal at the time birth rates of 1965. We would have had 8 million people. And by the time of my death at 80, say, we would have had 16 or 12 million people. And we're going to have a huge absence, a statistical absence of many more people than we actually have. And this is New Zealand. This curve here is so flat, it is almost like zero population growth rate. The thing is, with zero population growth rate, is that basically if you have sufficient houses here for 4 million people, you have quite sufficient houses for 4 million people here, and you have a gentle curve going to 5. It's only through the splitting up of households, through divorce and separation, that we've had any extra requirement, real extra requirement for houses. This is human tragedy. We cannot base a future on human tragedy, and this is insufficient to sustain a building industry. Building just 1 million houses, or the housing for just 1 million people. You know, about 300,000 houses over 30 years, Prime Minister. How much of a housing building industry is that? It's nothing. It's nothing at all. When we coped back here with moving in the 30-year period from 1 to 2 million people, or from 1.5 million people to 3 million people. We had 1.5 million people on a much lower population. 400,000 houses over 30 years. We were better off in the past. And that, as it is with houses, so it is with all other basic human necessary commodities. The lot. How can you have real growth with real productivity and real manufacturing when you just don't have enough people to sell into? I call this the deadbeat generation, and it outnumbers the living. Over 60 years, 5, we have 7 million people missing. Prime Minister, I call this whole area here statistical genocide, and I want to see some accountability for it, because it's the reason why our economy must collapse, as I will show in other diagrams. Now we are told that things are not like that anymore, and as a result we have a population column somewhat like this, where we have to support all the young and quite a bit of the old, and quite a few of the in between who are unemployed or on benefits or sick or whatever. In all, you have 50% of the working productive population supporting the other half of the population. Contrast that with a population column that's more traditional, where you have a lot of young people but by and large the very young are very small. They don't require much. It's only this upper level here with the children are adult level, and even then they require only somewhat near adult level of maintenance, not at all like an adult level. So you have all these people to support, but you only have a few young, and ideally not too many public servants and beneficiaries, but still you could get a situation of 50% and so on. However, this is a much more dynamic intergenerational thing, because people will support their children. They have a close relationship with their children. They have created the children. But here the children are spoilt somewhat. They are very expensive, these children, because you haven't got these other ones. Whereas here, if one child dies, the ultimate tragedy for childhood, you have other children as well. So no one child is so precious that you have to cater for that single child's demands. So you don't get a combined demanding dependent relationship. You get a dependent relationship, but it's respectful and dynamic. And so the emotional investment of the parents into the children is rewarded by their gratefulness toward the parents and their respect of the parents. Here the children realise they've got a lot of power, because if they die, the parents are totally bereft of that emotional connection. So there's a kind of blackmail going on between the generations here, a very nasty situation, whereas there this is far healthier, far more livable. And the old, there's very few of them. So there's a lot more respect of them. Here there's quite a few. Look at the narrowness of that on here. There's almost, much more than half, less than half. Where old age is as common as youth. Old age is not respected. But where youth is very common, old age being rare is respected and looked up to, because that's where everyone is travelling. And these young people are vigorous and healthy. All their bodily parts are new. They're not worn out. So they bounce back from illnesses and arm breakages and so on a lot more readily. Here there's just too much on the line. This is a dangerous population model to follow. And the general overall rewards of respect and responsibility and response is much more healthy, and therefore the dependency is probably less. So it's probably more like 75% in this group here who are supporting these, and these are not a high cost. These may well be out of respect, but again, the old don't require such a great deal. They're not expecting in such a dynamic society. The respect and authority they get for their wisdom and experience is reward enough for having attained that age. But here, they don't get those emotional kicks. They only get the money. So that's what they insist on. And that's what needs to be provided. Here the satisfactions are somewhere else. I far prefer a recommendation for this model, and elsewhere we see how dynamic economically this model is, and how dead and a drag in both senses this one is. This is a selfish model, this is the community model, and this is by far the most dramatic growth model. Now, it's sometimes said that we can fix the population column with immigration. So we'll get some new immigrants. But they tend to bring in their old people and their young. And the profile that we bring in, men and women, tends to match the middle classes of other countries. We take their doctors from some other third world or second world country. There's no such thing as a second world country, but some developing country as opposed to an underdeveloped country. We take their doctors engineers, nurses and qualified persons, and we turn them into beneficiaries here. This is not a model that can possibly work. There are resentments, jealousies and rivalries, and the potential for racial conflict. We now have 20 languages in our voting form. How on earth can you create a cohesive society with 20 language groups? Now, if you're an entrepot like Singapore or Hong Kong, or a dynamic city, urban, industrial, advanced culture, you maybe can do that, like an open city kind of situation. But New Zealand Prime Minister, barring the best will in the world, is simply not that. It won't work. We're already seeing these resentments and conflicts, and there'll be more of them as more and more of our immigrant community are unemployed, and as more and more of the core people are unemployed and see that some of our immigrant persons are more successful in business, and resentments will grow across those kind of groupings. You and I might cope with those things and think our way on either side of those issues, but can you trust that all your fellow New Zealanders will be able to do so? I am not so naive as to assume they can. I think they will not, and we have potential for very great social problems in the future. Not only that, but at the best, all it does is thicken the column. The same problem with the old and the young, but we don't have the advantage of an ever increasing numbers that's denied us. They tend to have the profile of ourselves, apart from some rare groupings. And we've seen how fatal that can be in France. I will briefly outline some of that. There's interesting sideways traffic economically, whatever grouping you take, even this one, but that's about all. And there is a considerable amount of vertical economic activity within the immigrant groups themselves, leading to resentment, jealousy and envy and so on. I wouldn't want to see that we insist that English be spoken in the street, or that every business must be run in the English language. But such groups could quickly become targets for any resentment if we don't have some kind of attempt to integrate and create a cohesive society. I just see enormous trouble in the next 5, 10, 15 years as this economic disaster bites. I can't see any way out of it at all. You look at Holland, which European population is going down, basically, and you have a very small, not that much, that's perhaps a bit too extreme, but you know, it's going down, and the numbers are actually reducing, as in Japan. Say this is Holland, similar in France, and then you have this very small group, even if it's only 6%. Their birth rate is higher for a start, so there's a curve upwards. It must intersect at some point. But not only is their birth rate higher, But the rate of that birth rate is higher. That they have their children younger, they have more of them, and they have them in a tighter grouping. They might have 5 or 6 children, 3 or 4 children between 20 and 30, whereas the Dutch are probably having their children like ourselves from nearly 30 to, you know, up to 45 over a longer period, and only have 2 children. So you can see that with the added factor of the tempo, you get a much more severe curve and a much earlier intersection, where an immigrant community like the Muslim community will overtake the Dutch community. And in 2 cities, Rotterdam and Amsterdam, it is postulated that by the year 2015, Prime Minister, those 2 cities in Holland will be Arabic-speaking majority cities. And we need to take note of that kind of thing when we buy in to the false notion that as a stopgap measure, immigration is some kind of solution. It is potentially the most massive social disaster you could possibly wish upon yourself. I would like to see Helen Clark and her government prosecuted and put in jail for such a treachery and betrayal of our country along those kind of false lines. It's completely and utterly false. And I wouldn't wish it on New Zealand, nor would I wish it on Holland. When we go to China, we expect to see Chinese people there. That is what is so interesting about China. We don't expect to see Germans or Americans or Polish people there, or something like that, or the place, you know, all the taxis run by the Africans and all the restaurants run by the Indians. We don't expect that in India. And would we be as interested if it were like that? There's almost no point in travelling to some of these other places because you have it all here. You know, I do find that personally interesting, but I do find that my fellow New Zealanders, when they discover this, the crunch of this economy upon them, will engender powerful violent emotions, I think, that it could be very tragic and fatal for our country. I'm not looking forward to that kind of future at all. We must find some way to roll it back. I don't care how we do it, we must do it. We must find a mechanism to roll that back or to change that outlook. And it's not by suppressing people like myself and discussion. We have got to have dramatic, full and rich and hard-nosed and top-notch discussion about these things without any kind of wishy-washy liberal thinking. That's ended. We do not have that option. We don't have the time. Taxation, Prime Minister. A very tricky subject. Historically, taxation was, say, 10%. They say that any tax level beyond that, you get people unwilling to pay it. But we have GST of 12.5%. And then on top of that we have 19% personal income tax. And on top of that we have rates. And on top of that we have fees and charges. And so on and so forth. And other people pay other taxes. Rego, fines and defaults, penalties and so on and so forth. So it can readily add up to over 50%. Even for a poor person, under say 20,000 a year, can easily be beyond 50% tax. Now, once upon a time I thought 100% tax would be slavery, and that anything over 50% was just far too close to that to be stomachable, that we could hardly bear it. Now, plainly enough, and this is the real tax rate I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, you know, when people think of tax, they think of the income tax. But there's business taxes and GST and other charges, petrol taxes, all manner of taxes. You add these together in the expenditure of a daily life and you get a concept called the real tax. Now, when we charge, when we have laws about credit card companies and their usurious rates of interest, in the USA that's 8%, 11%, 12%, 9%, 8%, percentages like that. Here it's as high as 23%. But they have to declare the real rate of interest. That's a requirement of the law. But here the government has a rate that is twice the rate of usury, easily, on a perfectly ordinary income. And yet we don't get any loan for it. How is it that the people can possibly bear this? I am just staggered that anything even half that is bearable by the people. Do our governments think that we are so stupid as to put up with this nonsense? Furthermore, and I thought that you know, at the 100% level or approaching it, you would get you know, this is law and good government, with freedom and liberty. Here you have, you know, beyond, you know, up to 25%, you have control and management. Control and management. And from 25 to say 45%, you have suppression and oppression beginning to build, and beyond that, definitely, you know, tyranny begins to grow. Tyranny and oppression and coercion. Of course, a lot of other things would happen before that. I think you would see big companies withdrawing from the country and investors leaving the country if we got to those kind of levels on a permanent basis. We must come back for all the levels of tax, especially for the poor. The first 10,000 should be tax free. At least allow the very poorest the first amount of tax free. But I see something else, actually. I see that when you get around the 50% level, and both the poorest classes, the middle classes, and now the rich are paying this kind of level, so everybody's paying that kind of level, you basically have half the country supported by the other half, which we saw in another diagram. One half of the country is paying the other half. So we are robbing Peter to pay Paul. We are literally taking in each other's washing. We're getting nowhere. And the tax rates, the real tax rate, reflects this. I now believe that the point of collapse for an economy is not the 100% mark, but you can just as easily collapse at the 50% mark. And you must withdraw rapidly from the 50% mark, below 40% within a year or two, as the real tax rate. You must have savage and severe cuts in the benefits and pensions and the allowances that people have, while cutting back on taxes as well. You must open up the economy again and give us this breathing space. This breathing space is our only remaining liberty and freedom. 10% is historically law and government, good governance, with freedom and liberty. 9%, the majority of your own money, is your own. So it should be. Here, we're only asking for 10% to be, in a sense, or 60% allowed to be held in the hand of the person, just to give them a taste of what liberty and freedom of action, to start your own business with excess funds, or to control your own life and take responsibility. Because at this point, you know, there's no advantage. You may as well be in one camp or the other. And the people in the government side, who tend to tell the people on the freedom side how to run their lives and so on, they haven't got a clue as to how money is actually created, how wealth is created, how you have to make something out of almost nothing. You have to grow something, you have to plant it, you have to water it, you have to look after it, you have to harvest it, you have to distribute it and carry it. You have to do things very strongly with the items in your control. And if you fail at any of these tasks, or any aspect of this task, you don't have an income. And so you urgently watch for how your activities unfold. Whereas the people who live off tax money, be it beneficiaries, pensioners, or government servants, you know, the money just rolls in some sort of vague, abstract way. And they tend to have the thought that money grows on trees, that you just print the money, that you just sign a thing, you know, a special drawing rights, or take out another loan, or get some more credit. It is these people who run the country. Whereas in actual fact, in this picture here, a traditional picture, the people ran the country. The government just governed it. And we must separate those two ideas out again. When we have the people who believe their money is just some sort of vague fog that ends up in their bank account and they can spend it on real things, but these people know exactly, in a very crunchy, real, gritty way, what money is worth and how it's done and created and operates. And have these idiots tell us what to do is ridiculous, and to make all sorts of fiddle-faddle laws, it makes it impossible. This is not liberty, this is control freakdom to the max. It's ridiculous, it's ludicrous, it's silly, and it's now being placed upon every man, woman and child in this country. There is no one of us who is free or liberated by any of this. And now we're under stress because this whole stupid scheme collapses at this 50% point. I did once think it had to go to 100%, because you'd find people who would say, oh, such and such a country, they've got 67% real tax rate. And that used to stump me for a long time, until I thought, yes, but what countries are those? Those are countries surrounded by tax rates, like in Lithuania and Estonia and so on, with much, much lower tax rates than that, because their economies have collapsed long ago, and so they take their cheaper holidays, their cheaper booze, and their cheaper offside relationships, shall we say, in those other countries. What we are really talking about here, when you have 50% real tax rates, in essence you are saying that one half of the country governs and runs and does tend to make the laws for the other half, and it's the least equipped half that is telling the most equipped half what to do with its money. These are the ones generating, creating and providing the money for these ones, but these ones are telling these ones what to do with it, mainly spending it on them. Prime Minister, if two people were doing that, this guy'd shoot that guy. This is just corruption, writ large and made normal. It is evil, it is wrong, it cannot, must not, and does not work. There is no way you can make that work. It's impossible. It's doomed. It must be ended as soon as possible. There's no way to do that, except if you say only these ones vote. A taxocracy. If we are to remain near this situation, where half the people are paid by the taxes of the other half, we must have a taxocracy. Otherwise money will just leave us and we will not have any money at all. At the moment you have people who gladly jump from one side to the other because there's as much money to be made doing nothing or having a sweet guaranteed job as there is in having a real productive and useful job. But it's a bit tougher. It's tough over here, or thought to be, and it's easy and kind over here. So no wonder on the easy and kind side, where they have the easy and kind outlook and they have the easy and kind view of how it all happens, all very soft and fluffy at the edges, you get your liberal thinking, your liberal socialistic thinking. It's not a matter of one side's right and one side's right too. It's one side's right and the other side has got to go. It's wrong. And we've got to make up their mind and do something. Otherwise we must institute this, where only the people who pay the taxes, who are net taxpayers, so public servants, beneficiaries and pensioners, don't vote. End of story. You know, this idea can be modified, but that basically is it. You know, does the beggar tell the millionaire that he's to spend half his money on the beggar? No. That would be called mugging of the most serious kind. That would be the subject for the serious crimes unit. We have instituted this crime and made it seem normal. It is abnormal in the experience of the entire history and current geopolitics of the human race. It's abnormal. It's only in the last 30, 40, 50 years we've had it like this, and it's been growing toward this, but obviously it cannot continue. We must cut off the pensioners, we must cut back on the public servant, we must cut back on the beneficiaries, and just sort of soft pedal on there, and so they get less, and these people then become useful and productive, and then we have 65%, 75% of the people living in reality, and this is their chance too to vote. If they pay some taxes, even $1 over their net, you know, if they receive $10,000 from the government, but they pay $10,001 in taxes, they get a vote. And if a rich man pays $10,000 in taxes, why not have a vote? And if he pays over that, why not give him a second? Now there are objections to the notion of growth through growth in population. Despite the fact that this has been the overwhelming experience of the human race over thousands of years, that wherever you have a burgeoning population, you have an advancing civilization, you have a growing economy, you have growing industrial development. Innovation is increased, the energy of the society is increased, everything flourishes. And people say, oh, there's a pressure on the environment, and so on and so forth. Unless we can more than suggest otherwise. And I put it to you that with an increasing population, that you have in large families, you have one car, probably a van or a station wagon or something like that, possibly a second one. But in small families where you have mum, dad and say one child, you're very likely to have 3 vehicles for the maturing young adult in the family, and if 2 children you might have 4. Whereas with larger families of 5 or 6, they're more devoted to education and food and clothing and expenditure like that. So you could say the larger family. Now there may be other explanations in your head in regard to these matters. You might say, oh, it's the business cycle. This is folly. It's all aspects of the market that are collapsing. It's the financial market, it's the property market, it's the market of real value, it's the competitive market, it's the industrial market, it's the manufacturing market. They're all collapsing because there just are not enough people contained within our borders. New Zealand is one of the least populated countries in the world, having such arable land and suitable land for development. We're about the same size as England or Japan, and the carrying capacity of those countries could be greatly increased. As I was saying about Japan, the 58 million people living in the Tokyo Basin, and yet most of the food probably comes pretty well from the Tokyo Basin or fairly close by. It's because you have intensive cultivation. You know, every quality of soil is developed to the maximum. You have sources of fertilizer and compost and so on, also at an intensive level. Food scraps and waste matter and waste products and so on, all can be put back into the soil and increase its quality. And this is so wherever you are in the world. The cities simply cannot exist otherwise, they simply cannot sustain themselves. And cities do in fact manage to do this. We don't know of any city that has failed. For the overpopulation argument to succeed, you must show a city, at least a concentrated region somewhere in the world that has failed with no other factor because of population, and there simply isn't one. Wherever you have increasing population or large concentrations of population, you have the best economic circumstances for the people in that region or in that country or in that part of the world. The world has got wealthier as the population of the entire planet has increased. This is not just through innovation, but just the efficiencies of having people close to one another and intensively being able to... The opposite extreme has been experienced, Invercargill, Japan as a whole now under danger, on a danger list if you like, and Russia, where the population is reducing currently at the rate of 700,000, almost 1 million people a year. Now this hasn't been going on just this year. It has obviously been tracked back, has been going on since the very late Stalinist and Khrushchev eras and so on, Brezhnev and so on. The population was slowing down and reducing and taking that pressure off. That's fatal. Fatal. Your economy is doomed going down that track. The expansion of Greece, the expansion of the Roman Empire is all based on a burgeoning population. The expansion of China into Tibet and the pressure they're putting on the borders with Russia today is part of their success. They will be a military and social and political success. Population is bigger than history. It's bigger than economics. It's the biggest thing upon this planet. And just so firing these bullets at us that have to be eaten. The only other time this demographic depredation, that is the reduction of population of an ethnos, of an ethnic population, of European peoples or of any persons, but particularly and specifically European peoples, has occurred, was in the situation of the Black Death, where over a short space of time half the population of Europe was eliminated by the plague. Now, at first, people felt wealthy. Uncle Horace had died, and they've come into his farm. So now they have their house in the town and Uncle Horace's farm. and they think, well, they're twice as wealthy. They feel twice as wealthy. But are they really? They've now got 2 properties to upkeep with only half the number of people. They've also, the produce of Uncle Horace's farm has only now got half the customers to sell the goods to, and the distances they can take his produce are not very great, not in those times. And that's the advantages of cities, of coalescing people together, because the surrounding intensively cultivated land can feed that city, and you don't have to go very far. Most of the food for Wellington comes from nearby. Most of the food from any city comes from nearby, including meat and eggs and milk and green vegetables and fruits. Almost all of it, the vast bulk of it, comes from within 20 or 30 kilometres. The further and further away you go, the fall off, the percentage of food being supplied is very dramatic. Now, sometimes people say, and this is another bullet to be bitten, because we've invested very heavily in this solution, which I think is entirely a false solution and has got a tremendously awful downside, is the issue of immigration. As I showed in one diagram, all it does is thicken the waist of the column, because we tend to select people having a similar profile to our own top-heavy column. They come here with their families, they have young children, but once they have obtained citizenship, they call forth, and their elderly, needy relatives have a right of entry. So they reproduce exactly within a short time. The population column just alongside, they create interesting sideways possibilities for trade and transaction, but that's all they do. There's no actual real increase. Now, when you have unemployment, when all this falls over, as it is at the moment, and has been building for that for years, it's deeply entrenched. I do not think there will be any recovery. I'm seeing things I've never seen before. There are 5 or 6 retail shops empty at the moment in Lambton Quay, and I'm informed by people that the offices above have 50% vacancy rates. So there's no quick recovery. It's not 6 months away, and nobody is talking even 12 months away, or 2 years, or 3. There is no more talk of the light at the end of that infernal tunnel. All I see myself is infernal tunnels opening up everywhere we look, and they all have a downslope, and the pit is getting darker and blacker by the minute. Prime Minister, I think it's time to take action based on reality and not on the dreamy nightmare that is a delusion and an illusion. And to bite deeply into it, you will find that marshmallow pavlova to be deeply drenched in poison. I speak the truth, and all those who understand me and understand this truth and understand everything I've been trying to tell you about. There are qualifications about any solution I might have, many qualifications. The road will not be smooth. It will be full of grainy detail, and much of it we will not like. pray for strength. Be good, be strong, but above all, be real.